It was a quiet morning in the city, the kind of morning where people moved quickly to reach their offices, some with coffee cups in hand, some staring at their phones, and others rushing so they would not be late. In the middle of all this, a tall man walked calmly down the street. He wore a plain dark hoodie, a pair of faded jeans and old sneakers. His hair fell around his shoulders, and a soft beard framed his face to anyone passing by. He looked like just another ordinary man blending into the crowd. That man was Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in the world. But the people on the street didn't even notice. Some walked past without a second glance, others maybe thought he looked familiar, but then dismissed the thought because why would a Hollywood star be walking alone in simple clothes? Keanu liked it this way. He never cared for flashy outfits or attention. He believed life was easier when you blended in rather than stood out. Keanu had a reason for being in this part of town. He was heading to a bank, not to pose for cameras or make a scene, but simply to handle some private financial matters. He could have sent someone else, maybe an assistant or a manager, but that was never his style. He preferred to do things himself, quietly. The glass doors of the bank reflected the busy street as he pushed them open. Inside, the cool air greeted him, and the steady hum of voices filled the lobby. Customers stood in line, some filling out forms, others waiting to be called. Behind the counters, tellers worked quickly, typing on keyboards and counting bills. Keanu walked in slowly, his hands in his pockets. He scanned the room with gentle eyes. He wasn't in a rush, he wasn't impatient. He simply walked toward the counter like any other person would. Nobody gasped, nobody screamed, nobody ran for an autograph. To them, he was just a man in a hoodie. A security guard near the entrance gave him a quick look, his eyes moving up and down the outfit. Nothing seemed threatening, but something about Keanu's calm and quiet walk made the guard keep an eye on him, perhaps thinking he didn't belong in such a polished space. After all, most of the customers were dressed in formal clothes, business suits or smart casual at least. Here was a man in sneakers, walking like he had all the time in the world. The bank lobby smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. The marble floor reflected the bright lights overhead. To most, this was just an ordinary morning of business. But for one man, this was about to become a story he would never forget. Keanu found his place in the queue. He stood patiently behind a woman counting documents in her hand. She barely looked up, and when she did, she gave him a polite smile, not recognizing who he was. Keanu nodded back with the same kindness he gave to everyone. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve nearby, whispering, "Mom, that man looks like John Wick." The mother hushed him quickly. Shaking her head, she didn't believe it. What were the chances of Keanu Reeves standing right there in their local bank? Meanwhile, the bank manager, a man dressed in a sharp navy blue suit with a golden tie, stood near his glass office. He had been watching the lobby, scanning the customers the way managers do. He liked to notice details, who seemed wealthy, who looked important, and who might be wasting time. When his eyes landed on Keanu, dressed in a hoodie, he raised an eyebrow. He leaned toward one of his colleagues and muttered something quietly. His tone carried disapproval, as if the simple clothes bothered him. Keanu, of course, heard none of this. He was too busy thinking about the questions he would ask at the counter. He always stayed polite, soft-spoken, and respectful. Even in situations where people didn't recognize him, he carried no arrogance. He had walked into that bank the same way he walked into many places before, with humility. A teller waved the next customer forward. The line moved slowly. Keanu stood patiently, looking around at the polished walls, the digital screens displaying exchange rates, and the posters promoting investment plans. Everything about the place was designed to impress. But Keanu wasn't the kind of person who was impressed by luxury. His focus was on simplicity. He just wanted to ask his questions and leave quietly. As the minutes passed, a few more customers walked in. One of them bumped into Keanu lightly, muttering a quick apology before moving ahead. Keanu smiled and said it was fine, his voice gentle. The person didn't even realize who they had just brushed against, and maybe that was for the best. The atmosphere in the bank felt calm, but beneath it, a small storm was already forming. The bank manager's thoughts about the man in the hoodie would soon shape an unforgettable moment. He had no idea that the person he had quietly judged was not only famous, but someone who had a deeper connection to the very bank he was managing. And so, Keanu stood there, patient as ever, waiting for his turn, unaware that within minutes, this ordinary visit would turn extraordinary, not because he wanted it to, but because of how others chose to see him. The bank manager stood tall near his office, his eyes always moving around the lobby like a hawk. He liked to think of himself as the guardian of the bank's image. In his mind, appearances meant everything. The way a person dressed, the way they spoke, even the way they walked. He believed all of these things told him who was important and who wasn't. When his eyes landed on Keanu, wearing that plain dark hoodie and those worn sneakers, he felt irritation rise inside him. It wasn't unusual for him to judge people based on their clothes, but this time he thought it was almost insulting. Here was a man standing in line, dressed like he was heading to a corner cafe rather than a financial institution. The manager leaned closer to one of his assistants and whispered something under his breath. People these days don't respect where they are. Look at him, walking in like this is a coffee shop. The assistant chuckled nervously, not sure how to respond. She glanced at Keanu and then back at the manager. She didn't recognize the man in the hoodie. She only saw what her boss saw, someone who didn't fit the polished, professional image the bank wanted. Meanwhile, Keanu remained calm, standing quietly in line. His hands resting in his pockets, he never noticed the stares. He never cared about being measured by his appearance. He had lived his whole life wearing simple clothes, even when millions of dollars were in his account. It didn't matter to him. He believed in being comfortable, in being himself, but to the bank manager, this was different. He prided himself on attracting wealthy clients, businessmen in pressed suits, women in elegant dresses, people who looked like they belonged in glossy magazines. In his eyes, those were the people worthy of his attention. He often bragged to colleagues about his ability to spot the right kind of client the moment they walked in. And to him, Keanu was certainly not one of them. Probably here to waste our time, the manager muttered again, crossing his arms, his golden watch shining under the bright lobby lights. They come asking silly questions. Never serious business, his assistant nodded quickly, not daring to disagree. What the manager didn't realize was that several other customers in the bank had noticed Keanu. One or two had even thought he looked familiar. But they kept it to themselves. They were too shy to say anything. After all, who would expect Keanu Reeves, the famous movie star, to be standing in line just like them? The manager, however, was blind to it. He was too busy focusing on the hoodie. To him, that single piece of clothing told the entire story. He didn't see kindness in Keanu's posture. He didn't see humility in the way he patiently waited. He only saw ordinary, and in the manager's world, ordinary wasn't good enough. Keanu glanced at the posters on the wall, reading quietly about different investment opportunities. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't restless. He simply observed like he always did. He had a habit of being present in the moment, noticing the details that most people ignored. He saw the nervous hands of the woman in front of him as she shuffled her documents. He noticed the tired look on the teller's face as she counted bills again and again. These were small pieces of life that he respected. But the bank manager only grew more impatient, his eyes narrowing every time Keanu shifted in line. He whispered again, this time louder. He should have scheduled an appointment. Clients who are serious do not just walk in like this. The assistant gave a quick nod, though her eyes lingered on Keanu with a faint curiosity. Something about his calm presence seemed unusual, though she still couldn't place him. At one point, Keanu looked up and caught the manager's gaze. Instead of glaring, he gave a small, polite nod, the kind of nod you give to a stranger acknowledging their presence. The manager, however, did not return the gesture. Instead, he looked away quickly, pretending to be busy, as if acknowledging Keanu would somehow lower his own status. The irony of the moment filled the air like static. Here stood a man who had worked his entire career believing he could judge wealth by a suit or a tie. And there, only a few steps away, stood one of the most famous and wealthiest men in the world, dressed in a way that completely broke the manager's rules. The lobby continued to buzz with activity. The sound of pens scratching against paper, the clicking of keyboards, and the occasional cough echoed in the room. But beneath that everyday noise, there was tension slowly building. The kind of tension that comes when arrogance collides with humility. Keanu shifted slightly, still waiting patiently, unaware of the manager's thoughts, unaware of the whispers. He was just another customer in his own eyes, someone with a simple task to complete, yet in the mind of the man watching him, he had already been labeled, judged, and dismissed. The bank manager smiled proudly at a man in a gray suit who walked by, offering him a firm handshake. "Good to see you again, sir," he said loudly. Making sure others heard, he loved these moments, showing everyone how connected he was with important people. After the man walked away, the manager turned his eyes back to Keanu, shaking his head slightly. as though the hoodie itself was an insult to his bank. Little did he know, that same hoodie would soon teach him the most unforgettable lesson of his career. The line moved slowly, one customer finished. Another stepped forward, and the sound of footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. Keanu waited calmly, his eyes on the teller ahead. He carried no papers, no heavy files, just himself. As simple as always, when his turn finally came, he stepped forward with a polite smile. "Good morning," he said gently, his voice calm. The teller, a young woman with tired eyes but a warm smile, looked up. She greeted him back with routine courtesy. "Good morning, sir. How may I help you today?" she asked, her fingers already resting near the keyboard, ready to type. Keanu leaned slightly forward, his tone polite but curious. "I'd like to ask a few questions about investment accounts," he said. His words were simple, his request clear. He wasn't demanding, he wasn't rushing. Just asking like any other client who wanted information. The teller nodded, her hands moving over the keyboard as she began to pull up the details. To her, this was nothing unusual. People asked about accounts all the time. She didn't recognize the man before her, not with his hoodie and quiet manner. She simply saw another customer, and she treated him with the same kindness she offered everyone. But the bank manager, standing only a few steps away, had been watching closely. He leaned on the counter as though he had business being there, though in truth he was only there to listen. His lips curled slightly in irritation. In his mind, this wasn't a client worth the bank's time. He whispered just loud enough for a colleague to hear. "Probably doesn't even have the balance for what he's asking about." His voice carried judgment. Not caring if it reached ears it shouldn't, Keanu, standing only a few feet away, heard the comment clearly, but he didn't react. He simply kept his calm smile. The teller, trying to stay professional, asked, "Do you already hold an account with us?" "Sir?" Keanu nodded slightly. "Yes, I do. But I wanted to understand some of the investment options," he said, his tone steady as though nothing could disturb his peace. The manager stepped closer now, his shoes clicking against the floor. His presence made the teller stiffen slightly. She wasn't sure why her boss was suddenly so interested in this customer. Usually he only came forward for high-profile clients, not for a man in a hoodie. "Is everything all right here?" the manager asked. His tone dripping with false politeness, he gave Keanu a quick glance up and down, his eyes landing on the hoodie as if it were an offense. Keanu turned his head and gave a polite nod. "Yes, everything is fine," he said softly. The manager smiled faintly, though it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that carried judgment. He looked at the teller and then back at Keanu. "You know, sir, for serious discussions about investments, clients usually schedule private appointments." His voice carried an edge, his eyes sharp. He wanted to make a point. Keanu tilted his head slightly, still calm. "I see," he replied, his voice never rising, never showing annoyance. "I just thought I'd come in and ask directly." The manager let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Of course, but usually those kinds of discussions are reserved for clients who prepare a little more." His eyes dropped once again to the hoodie, making his meaning clear. A couple of customers nearby caught the exchange, their eyes flicking toward the man in the hoodie and the sharply dressed manager. They didn't understand what was happening, but they sensed something unfair in the way the manager spoke. The teller looked uncomfortable. She knew her boss was being unprofessional, but she didn't dare interrupt. She simply glanced at Keanu almost apologetically, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Keanu gave her a reassuring smile, as though telling her it was all right. He wasn't upset, he wasn't offended. He had heard worse in his life, and he knew better than to waste energy on arrogance. But still, the manager's words lingered in the air. Heavy with mockery, perhaps, the manager continued. "Before you ask about large investment accounts, you might consider presenting yourself more suitably. Banking is a serious business, and clients who want to be taken seriously usually dress the part." His words were smooth, but each one carried the sting of condescension. Keanu listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply stood there, letting the manager speak. The calmness in his eyes was almost disarming, like water refusing to fight fire. The teller finally cleared her throat, trying to continue her work. "Sir, would you like me to explain the available options?" she asked gently, hoping to move the conversation back to business. Keanu nodded kindly. "Yes, please," he said, his attention turning back to her, ignoring the buzzing arrogance beside him. But the manager wasn't done. He leaned a little closer, his voice low but sharp. I'm just saying, sir, this is a respectable institution, and when you walk in like this asking about big accounts, people may not take you seriously. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Keanu met the manager's gaze, his eyes calm, almost amused, and then he gave a faint smile, the kind of smile that said he understood more than the other man could ever know. He didn't respond with anger. He didn't raise his voice, he simply let the moment pass. The lobby carried on with its usual noise. People moving, papers shuffling, numbers being typed into systems, but a few customers kept stealing glances toward the scene. They could feel something building, something they didn't quite understand, and Keanu, standing there in his simple hoodie, remained steady, polite, and patient, completely unaware that in just a short while, this quiet exchange at the counter would explode into a moment that no one in the bank would ever forget. The air inside the bank felt heavier now. The soft hum of voices and the clicking of keyboards continued. But around Keanu and the manager, a quiet tension had started to grow. Some customers sensed it and looked over occasionally, pretending to be busy but curious enough to listen. The manager, standing tall with his polished shoes and golden watch, decided to make his thoughts even clearer. He looked at Keanu with a smirk, his voice louder than before. "You know, sir, banking isn't like walking into a grocery store," he said. "This is a place for serious clients, people who come prepared, people who understand that image matters." His eyes went straight to Keanu's hoodie, as if the fabric itself offended him. Keanu kept his calm expression. He didn't frown. He didn't fight back. He simply gave the manager a small nod. His voice soft. "I understand," he said. But the manager wasn't finished. He enjoyed the attention of those who were beginning to notice the scene. He raised his chin slightly. "Look, I don't mean to embarrass you, but you might want to consider dressing better if you want to talk about big accounts. People expect professionalism, not casual clothes." The word casual almost sounded like an insult in his mouth. The teller shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. She wanted to say something, but her boss's presence made her lips stay sealed. Instead, she looked at Keanu apologetically, her eyes saying what her mouth could not. A man in line behind Keanu leaned slightly to one side. Trying to hear better, he didn't recognize Keanu either, but he knew unfairness when he saw it. The manager's tone carried mockery, and it wasn't the way a client should be treated. No matter what they wore, Keanu, however, stood like a calm lake, unshaken by the ripples of arrogance thrown his way. "Thank you for the advice," he said simply, his words polite, his tone even. The manager let out a dry laugh, the kind of laugh that held no warmth. "Advice is free, my friend," he said, "but investments are not. So before you waste anyone's time, make sure you're really ready." There was silence for a moment, and in that silence the weight of the insult sank into the air. The customers nearby pretended to focus on their forms or their phones, but their ears were tuned in. Some of them frowned, wondering how someone could speak this way. The teller finally tried to break the moment. She cleared her throat softly. "Sir, if you'd like, I can show you the details of our investment packages," she said gently to Keanu, her voice almost protective. She wanted to move things forward, to give the man in front of her some dignity back. Keanu gave her a kind smile. "Yes, please," he said, as though nothing had happened, his eyes calm, his voice steady. But the manager refused to step back. He leaned closer, his voice dropping lower but sharp enough to cut. "Look," he said, "clients who truly belong here don't walk in dressed like they rolled out of bed. They schedule appointments, they come prepared, and they present themselves like people who actually have money." The words stung the air, the mockery now open, no longer hidden behind polite phrases. It was direct, harsh, and filled with arrogance. Keanu's lips curled into the faintest smile, not mocking, not bitter, but almost amused, as if he had seen this kind of behavior too many times before. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He simply stood quietly, allowing the manager's own words to echo against the marble walls. The security guard at the door noticed the exchange now. His eyes shifting between the two men, he didn't move, but he sensed something unusual was happening. He wondered why the manager was so hostile, yet he stayed in place, waiting. Customers continued to sneak glances, some whispering softly to each other. One woman shook her head slightly, her lips tight. She didn't know who the man in the hoodie was, but she knew the manager's tone was wrong. Keanu, still patient, asked the teller a simple question. "Could you explain the difference between short-term and long-term investment options?" His voice smooth, calm, respectful, As though the manager's cutting remarks didn't exist, the teller nodded quickly, eager to focus on her job. But before she could speak, the manager interrupted again, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, that's a big question for someone who didn't even come with a notebook," he said. "Do you even know what you're asking for?" The teller's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Not for herself, but for the man in front of her. She wished her boss would stop, but she knew arguing with him was pointless. Keanu, still unbothered, gave a faint smile. "Yes," he replied softly, "I do." And in that moment, something shifted in the room. The arrogance of the manager stood in sharp contrast to the calm dignity of the man he mocked. The scene felt almost like a stage, the audience being the customers and staff who pretended not to stare but couldn't look away. What the manager didn't know, what nobody in that room yet understood, was that the man he was trying so hard to humiliate had the power to change his life in an instant. With just a word, with just a decision, and soon, that truth would unfold before their eyes. But for now, the manager smiled smugly, thinking he had made his point, unaware that he was only digging himself deeper into a hole that would soon swallow his pride whole. The bank lobby carried on with its usual rhythm, the clicking of keyboards, the shuffling of papers, the murmurs of customers filling forms, yet around the counter where Keanu stood, the air felt heavier, the tension could almost be touched. It was like two different worlds colliding, one of arrogance and one of quiet humility. The manager, feeling proud of his remarks, adjusted his tie and folded his arms. He believed he had put the man in the hoodie in his place in his mind. He was teaching a lesson about serious business. What he didn't realize was that every extra word only revealed more of his own arrogance. Keanu, on the other hand, remained still, his posture relaxed, his face calm, his voice gentle whenever he spoke. The more the manager mocked, the calmer Keanu seemed to become. It was as if the insults rolled off him like water from a stone. The teller tried to keep the conversation on track. She began explaining, "Sir, we have several options for investments, depending on whether you are looking for short-term or long-term returns." Her voice was soft. Her eyes focused on Keanu. She wanted to keep him comfortable despite her boss standing there like a storm. Keanu nodded politely, asking follow-up questions. "What about the risks? How flexible are these accounts if someone wants to adjust later?" His questions were intelligent, precise. They showed he understood far more than the manager assumed. But before the teller could finish her explanation, the manager interrupted again, his words sharp. "Look, I don't think you quite understand. These aren't basic savings accounts. These are serious investments, meant for clients with real financial power. It's not the kind of thing people just walk in and ask about," he said, his eyes narrowing at the hoodie again. A couple of customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats nearby. One man shook his head slightly, whispering to the woman next to him, "That manager's being rude." She nodded, her eyes fixed on Keanu, who still hadn't raised his voice or shown even a flicker of anger. Keanu listened quietly, then turned back to the teller. "Please go on," he said softly, his voice calm, refusing to let the arrogance around him control the moment. The teller continued, describing the benefits of long-term investment, explaining the interest rates and stability. Keanu listened carefully, nodding at the right moments. His calm attention made her feel respected, something she rarely felt with wealthy clients who often rushed her. But again, the manager couldn't hold his tongue. He leaned forward, speaking in a tone that was half mockery, half warning. "Do you even have the funds for this?" he asked bluntly, his words echoing in the lobby. A few heads turned sharply, surprised he would ask such a question so directly. Keanu looked at him for a moment. His eyes deep but gentle, he didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held patience. Finally, he replied softly, "Yes, I do." Just 3 words, but they carried a quiet power. The manager scoffed, rolling his eyes slightly. "Well, forgive me, but you don't look like the type," he muttered, his voice carrying to the customers nearby. This time a few of them frowned openly. One woman crossed her arms, clearly uncomfortable with how far the mockery had gone. The teller lowered her gaze, ashamed of her boss's words. She wished she could apologize on his behalf, but instead she continued her explanation, determined to treat Keanu with the respect he deserved. Keanu leaned slightly on the counter, asking more thoughtful questions, his tone still calm. He acted as though the manager's insults were nothing but background noise. His focus remained on the teller, on the information, on the reason he had come. But the manager grew restless. The more Keanu ignored him, the more he wanted to provoke. "Listen, sir," he said firmly. "We don't just give out information on large accounts to anyone who walks in. If you're not a serious client, you're wasting our time." His voice carried a finality, like he was trying to end the conversation altogether. Keanu looked at him again, this time with a calm gaze that lingered a little longer, his eyes steady, as though he were measuring the manager's soul. He didn't say anything harsh, didn't strike back, but the silence itself was powerful. It made the manager shift slightly, uncomfortable under the weight of that quiet stare. Customers in the lobby whispered softly now, some curious, some frustrated. The tension was no longer hidden. It was clear that the manager was going too far, and yet the man in the hoodie, so calm, so patient, was handling it with a grace none of them expected. The teller spoke again quickly, her voice gentle. "Sir, if you'd like, we can schedule a private meeting to discuss your investments further," she said, hoping to ease the situation. Keanu gave her a kind nod. "That would be fine," he replied softly, but the manager couldn't resist a final jab. "Yes, but next time," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "You might want to come dressed properly, otherwise people will think you don't belong here." The words hung in the air like smoke. Heavy, bitter, impossible to ignore. Some customers shook their heads in disbelief. Others looked at Keanu with sympathy, and yet Keanu, as always, remained calm. His face relaxed, his voice steady. "I see," he said simply. Those two words carried no anger, but they carried something else. Something the manager didn't yet recognize. A quiet authority that would soon reveal itself. The lobby returned to its ordinary rhythm, but for those who witnessed the exchange, the moment was unforgettable. They had just seen arrogance rise higher and higher, blind to the truth standing right before it. And though none of them knew it yet, the lesson was about to come crashing down in the most shocking way possible. The lobby seemed to freeze for a moment. The sound of keyboards and shuffling papers faded into the background. The manager had just finished his last mocking remark. Feeling proud of himself, he straightened his suit, certain he had won the little battle of appearances. He didn't realize that the man standing calmly in front of him was about to change everything. Keanu stayed silent for a few seconds. His eyes calm, his posture relaxed. He didn't rush. He didn't try to prove himself quickly. Instead, he let the silence linger, making the manager shift slightly as if he had lost control without even knowing why. Then Keanu spoke softly, his voice steady. "Do you know who owns this branch?" he asked. His words were gentle, not angry, not boastful, but they carried a strange weight. The teller froze mid-typing, her hands hovering over the keyboard. The manager blinked, confused, and then let out a laugh. "You," the manager said mockingly, "own this branch?" "Surely not." His tone dripped with sarcasm, his smile smug. "People like you don't own banks. They just visit them." A few customers who had been watching leaned in closer, curiosity filling their eyes. They didn't understand what was happening, but something about Keanu's calmness and the manager's arrogance made the moment feel important. Keanu reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out a small leather wallet. He opened it and slid an identification card across the counter toward the teller. She picked it up carefully, her eyes scanning the details, her face slowly changing, surprise washing over her features. She looked at Keanu, then at the manager, then back at the card. Her lips parted slightly as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The manager frowned, impatient. "What is it?" he asked sharply, his voice annoyed. He leaned over, trying to grab a look. The teller hesitated, then finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "Sir, this shows that he is one of the largest stakeholders of this bank." Her words came out slowly, almost like she was still trying to process it herself. The manager froze, his smug smile vanished instantly. His face turned pale, his eyes widened as he looked at the card. Then at Keanu, then back again. He couldn't find words, he stammered. That's impossible." His voice cracking under the weight of disbelief, but it wasn't impossible. It was the truth standing right in front of him, the man he had mocked for wearing a hoodie, the man he had judged as unfit for serious banking, was in fact one of the very people who had the power to shape the future of the institution. The lobby fell into a strange silence. Customers who had overheard gasped quietly. Some covered their mouths. Others looked at each other in shock. The security guard at the door stiffened, now realizing the man he had casually watched was not an ordinary customer. Keanu looked at the teller kindly, giving her a reassuring nod. "Thank you," he said softly, then turned his eyes back to the manager. his voice calm, steady, yet carrying an unshakable authority. "I'm here because I trust this bank with my investments," he said. "Not because of how people dress, but because of how they are treated." The words echoed across the marble lobby, heavy and unforgettable. The customers who had been watching felt goosebumps rise on their skin. The teller lowered her gaze. Embarrassed for her boss, the manager stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly. His golden watch gleaming uselessly under the lights, he opened his mouth to speak. But no words came. He stammered again. I didn't realize. I didn't know who you were." His voice now small, stripped of the arrogance it carried only minutes ago. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold. He didn't show anger. He simply gave a faint smile, the kind of smile that held both kindness and quiet disappointment. "It's never about who people are," he said gently. "It's about how you treat them with or without a suit. Everyone deserves respect." The manager's heart pounded in his chest, sweat forming at the edge of his forehead. He felt every eye in the lobby burning into him. Customers who had once admired his confidence now looked at him with disapproval. He had mocked the wrong man, and the humiliation was written across his face. The teller slowly handed the identification card back to Keanu, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her tone respectful now, almost reverent. Keanu took the card back, sliding it calmly into his wallet. He didn't gloat, he didn't boast. He simply acted as though nothing extraordinary had just happened, and that made it even more powerful. The manager finally lowered his head slightly, his pride crumbling. I apologize, sir," he said, his voice weak, his earlier arrogance gone. "I didn't mean to offend, I was only trying to maintain standards." The excuse sounded hollow. Even to his own ears, Keanu's calm eyes met his. "Standards are important," he said softly, "but respect is more important. Remember that." The entire lobby remained still, people absorbing every word. For them, this was no longer just a simple visit to the bank. It was a story they would carry with them, a lesson they would never forget. And as Keanu stood there, tall and calm in his simple hoodie, it became clear to everyone that real power did not need a suit. It did not need arrogance, it only needed humility, respect, and quiet strength. The bank lobby was still quiet. The kind of silence that comes when people witness something they know is bigger than an ordinary day. Customers who had been filling forms stopped writing. Some who had been checking their phones now stared openly. Everyone had felt the shift in the air. The man in the hoodie was no ordinary visitor, and the manager's arrogance had just collapsed in front of all. The manager swallowed hard, his throat dry. He forced a smile that looked weak, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "Sir, please forgive me, I didn't know." "I should not have spoken the way I did," his hands fidgeted, pulling at his suit jacket as if adjusting it would fix the damage. Keanu looked at him, calm as ever, his eyes soft but firm. He didn't shout. He didn't try to humiliate. Instead, he spoke in the same gentle tone he always carried. "It's not about knowing who people are," he said. "It's about how you treat them. Everyone deserves respect, whether they wear a suit or a hoodie." The words cut deeper than any anger could have. The manager felt them sink into him, and the customers watching nodded slightly. They knew the truth in those words. Many of them had felt judged in places like this before, and now they saw someone finally say what they had always wanted to hear. The teller lowered her eyes, ashamed of the way her boss had behaved. Yet she also felt grateful, because this moment had reminded her that kindness mattered more than titles. She glanced at Keanu, silently thanking him for his grace. The manager tried to recover, his voice stumbling as he spoke again. Yes, of course, you are absolutely right. Sir, I should not have judged, I should not have spoken in that manner. I regret it deeply," he said, but his words sounded empty. They were not spoken out of true respect. But out of fear, Keanu, however, didn't press further. He wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. He had lived long enough to know that true lessons are learned quietly, not through loud punishment. He simply nodded. "I hope you remember this the next time someone walks through those doors," he said. "Because you never know who they might be, and more importantly, they should never have to prove themselves to be treated with dignity." The sentence hung in the air like a truth no one could deny. Customers whispered softly to one another, some even smiling faintly. They knew they had just witnessed a rare moment where power didn't roar, it whispered. And yet it was stronger than anything else. The manager nodded quickly, almost too quickly. Yes, of course," he muttered, his voice shaky. He could feel sweat forming at the back of his neck. His pride had been broken, and there was no suit, no tie. No golden watch that could hide it? Keanu turned his attention back to the teller, his smile kind. "Thank you for your patience," he said softly. She gave a small smile back, her voice quiet. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her tone filled with respect that came not from fear but from admiration. At that moment, a boy who had been sitting with his mother nearby tugged at her sleeve, whispering excitedly, "Mom, that's John Wick." His mother looked at him in surprise, and when her eyes fell on Keanu, recognition finally dawned. She gasped quietly, realizing the man in the hoodie was indeed the famous actor. A ripple moved through the lobby as more people began to recognize him, whispers spreading like waves. Some people covered their mouths, others smiled with awe, but Keanu remained the same, calm, humble, almost as if he didn't notice the growing attention. The manager felt the stares burning into him now. He knew the story would spread beyond this lobby. He knew people would remember how he had mocked a man for his clothes, only to discover that same man was both a world-famous star and a major stakeholder in the bank. But Keanu wasn't thinking of revenge or humiliation. His mind was on the lesson. He wanted the moment to speak louder than his fame. He wanted the arrogance to fade, replaced by a reminder that respect costs nothing but means everything. He stepped back slightly, preparing to leave, his movements calm and unhurried before walking away. He looked at the manager one last time. "Power is not in money, not in clothes, not in status," he said softly. "It's in how you treat people when you think no one is watching." The words landed like thunder in the silence, simple, gentle, yet unforgettable. The manager lowered his head, unable to meet his eyes. Keanu turned and walked toward the exit, his hoodie swaying lightly as he moved. No security, no flashing cameras, just a man leaving as quietly as he had arrived. The customers watched him go, some smiling, some shaking their heads in amazement, all knowing they would never forget this day. As the glass doors closed behind him, the lobby seemed to exhale, the noise of keyboards and voices slowly returning. Yet nothing felt the same. The manager stood still, his arrogance gone, replaced by the heavy weight of his own mistake. The teller sat straighter now, inspired by the man in the hoodie, inspired by the reminder that kindness mattered more than any rule of appearance. She promised herself silently that she would never forget this, and the customers who had witnessed everything carried the story in their hearts, a story they would share with others, a story that was no longer just about a bank visit, but about a lesson in humanity. After Keanu walked out of the bank, the lobby remained quiet for several moments. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The glass doors had closed behind him, yet his presence still lingered. People who had witnessed everything were still staring at the entrance, their minds replaying what they had just seen. The bank manager stood frozen near the counter, his face pale, his shoulders stiff. He felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on him. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only regret and embarrassment. He had mocked a man he thought was ordinary, only to discover that the man not only carried fame but also power within the very bank he worked for. The teller sat quietly, her heart still beating fast. She had felt the tension, the shame, and then the calm strength of the man in the hoodie. She whispered to herself, "Respect costs nothing." Repeating the lesson she had just heard, she knew she would never forget those words. Customers began whispering softly to each other, some shaking their heads, some smiling in amazement. One woman leaned toward her friend and said, "Imagine we just saw Keanu Reeves, and he taught the manager a lesson he'll never forget." Her friend nodded quickly. "He didn't even need to raise his voice," she added. The manager finally moved, running his hand nervously across his face. He tried to speak, but no one cared to listen. The respect he had once commanded in that lobby was gone. The customers no longer looked at him with admiration. They looked at him with judgment. The story spread faster than the manager could have imagined. Within hours, staff members whispered about it in the hallways. Customers carried it outside, telling family and friends about the day Keanu Reeves walked in wearing a hoodie and humbled the arrogant bank manager. Soon the tale became a lesson repeated in homes, offices, and cafes inside the bank. Things began to change. The teller treated every customer with even more kindness than before. Remembering the words spoken by Keanu, she made a silent promise to herself that she would never judge someone based on clothes or appearance again. She realized true respect was about looking beyond the surface. The manager struggled with the memory. At night he replayed the scene in his mind, the smirk he wore, the mocking words he had spoken, the calm and gentle replies he had received, and finally, the crushing truth when the identification card revealed everything. He wished he could go back. He wished he had held his tongue, but it was too late. The lesson had been given, and it burned inside him. Over time, the story of the man in the hoodie became a reminder within the bank. New employees heard it from older staff. Customers whispered it to each other when they visited. "This is the place where the manager mocked Keanu Reeves," they said. And Keanu taught him that respect matters more than suits or titles. Outside the bank, Keanu continued his life as he always did. Quietly, humbly, without chasing attention. He never spoke of the incident to the media. He never bragged. For him, it was just another day. Another chance to live his values. He didn't need the world to know. He only needed to stay true to himself. But for the people in that bank, it became unforgettable. The teller often told her friends, "He didn't shout, he didn't get angry. He just smiled and spoke kindly." And it was enough to silence arrogance. Her friends listened with wide eyes, realizing that true strength never needed loudness. The young boy who had whispered to his mother that day never forgot it either. When he grew older, he told the story to his classmates. "I saw John Wick in real life," he would say. But he wasn't fighting anyone. He was teaching respect. His friends laughed in disbelief. But he insisted it was true. And as for the manager, though he tried to continue his work, he could never escape the shadow of that day. Every time a customer in simple clothes walked in, he remembered his mistake. Every time he looked at his reflection in his golden watch, he saw the face of a man who had judged too quickly. The lesson followed him everywhere, reminding him that pride can be broken in an instant, that humility is stronger than arrogance, and that respect is the foundation of true power. He learned it the hard way, but he learned it forever. Keanu's visit that morning was short, just a few minutes in the lobby of a bank. Yet the ripples of his calm words spread like waves in water, touching everyone who had been there, reaching even those who only heard the story secondhand. It became a tale not about money, not about fame, but about humanity. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't the bank account, the investments, or even the ownership that people remembered. It was the quiet moment when a man in a hoodie reminded everyone that respect is not earned by clothes or wealth. It is something we all owe each other as human beings, and so, the story of the bank manager and the man in the hoodie lived on, whispered in lobbies, retold in cafes, passed between friends and families, not just as a funny incident, but as a moral lesson, proof that even the simplest act of kindness, or the calmest words of truth, can change the way people see the world.